Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew. Now in today's tutorial I'm going to be continuing along the same lines of the tutorials that I did last week, all about truing. Last week I showed you how to true darts and seams, and today I'm going to be showing you how to true a sleeve, checking that the sleeve fits into the armhole of a garment. Now the same process applies whether you're working with a pattern that you have adjusted or a pattern that you have drafted. So collect up your supplies and we can begin. Now throughout this tutorial I'm going to be working with my free coping pattern, and I'm working with one of the patterns that I've altered. I've added princess seams and a v-neck, which you can do following my tutorials. However, the same rules apply no matter what pattern you're working with. If you're working with a pattern that you've made amendments to, or perhaps you're drafting your own patterns from your own block or sloper. Prior to looking at how to true the sleeve, you need to make sure that you have trued all of the seams together. I will pop a link here to my truing seams tutorial so that you know how to do this. You also need to make sure that you true any darts, because you may find that you need to make amendments to any seams that have discrepancies. And you want to do this prior to truing the sleeve in case you need to make any amendments around the armhole area. You also want to true the seams together in the sleeve. So this is a one-piece sleeve, so I simply have one seam here and one seam here, and both of these need to be trued together so that they are the same length if you have made any amendments to the pattern, or perhaps if you're drafting your own pattern from scratch. Obviously, if you have a two-piece or three-piece sleeve, you need to work your way through the sleeve pattern pieces, truing all of the seams. Once you've gone ahead and you have trued all of the garment pieces together, you've trued any darts and you've also trued the sleeve seams so that you know that all of these seams are going to sew together as they should, then we can look at truing the sleeve to fit into the armhole. You're going to need to start by measuring the whole of the armhole. And when I say measuring, I mean measuring the stitching line. So if you're working with an already existing pattern, the pattern may have seam allowances on it. And you can see here that I've clearly gone around and drawn red lines and hashed out the area that is my seam allowance. The drawn red lines are the stitching lines. So on the pattern that I'm working with, they're 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters in from the edge. Now your pattern might have a different seam allowance, so you're going to need to draw that on. And you want to do it all the way around the armhole, so all of the pieces that make up the armhole. Please do work with a sharp pencil. I'm using Sharpie so that it's clear for you to see. Now you need to draw the stitching lines onto all of the pattern pieces that create the armhole. And this will depend on the pattern that you're working with. You may simply have a front and a back, or you may have more pieces like I have here. So this is my front pattern piece, the shoulder and the start of the armhole. The armhole then continues into the side front, then into the side back, and finally on the back pattern piece up to the shoulder. I will need to measure all of these pieces on the stitching lines separately and then add the figures together so that I have the full measurement for my armhole. Remember that you're going to have a seam allowance in from the edge and also from any seams that you're joining. So I've got a seam on this side and a seam on this side. The same with the back. I've got a seam at the shoulder, a seam in from the armhole, and a seam where the back piece joins to the side back. Obviously, if you don't have seam allowances on your pattern, perhaps you're drafting your own pattern, then you can measure the edge of your paper. As well as having a measurement for the entire armhole, it will also be useful to have a measurement simply for the front of the armhole and for the back of the armhole, because we will compare that to the front and the back of the sleeve. Now, with the pattern that I'm working with, the back of the armhole will start at the shoulder because I will have a notch on my sleeve that connects to the shoulder seam. Now, if you don't have a shoulder seam in the pattern that you're working with, you should have a notch, a circle or a square or some form of marking that enables you to connect the top of the sleeve cap to the shoulder area. The back of my armhole will continue down the back piece and down the side back piece until I get to my side seam here. And the side seam is where my side back joins my side front in this pattern piece. in your pattern piece, you may or may not have a seam down here that will join to either a seam on the sleeve, or again, if you have a 2-piece or 3-piece sleeve, it might be that you don't have a seam along the underarm. You might again have a notch, a circle, a square, or another marking that you will match to either a side seam, or if your garment doesn't have a side seam, a notch or a marking. So it's just a case of looking at the pattern that you're working with and deciding where the back of the sleeve will connect and where the front of the sleeve will connect. My front will start at the side seam here, continue up the side front piece, and then it will work up the front piece until I get to the shoulder. So as well as having that full measurement of the armhole, I will take a measurement of the front and the side front pieces for the front of the sleeve, and the side back and the back pieces for the back of the sleeve. Now I'm going to show you how I will measure these curved seams accurately. To measure any curves accurately, I recommend that you use a tape measure or a curved ruler. Now, when I'm measuring curves, I always measure them with the tape measure on the edge. I find this is the most accurate way. I also do it so that I'm positioning the figures or the measurements on the tape measure down onto the line that I want to measure. So with inches, I would position the tape measure this way. With centimetres, I've got my centimetres at the bottom there, so I would still position the tape measure this way. Now, I'm going to pop the tape measure right on the edge of where my stitching line of my shoulder joins the stitching line of the armhole. Yours will be more accurate because you'll be working with a pencil line. And then I'm going to simply hold the tape measure and pivot it along the curve. So I will position my next hand about 1.5 inches, 3 to 4 centimetres away from the first hand. And then I will move my hand along, holding the tape measure and shaping it around the shape that you're measuring. When I get to the end where my stitching lines meet, I will write down the measurement. It doesn't matter if you're working in inches or centimetres here, the same rules apply. I recommend writing down the measurements on each of the pattern pieces. You're going to need to do this for all of the pieces that connect to create the armhole. I'm going to leave you to do this for the rest of the pieces. Once you've gone ahead and measured all of the garment pieces, you're also going to need to measure your sleeve piece. So this is my sleeve pattern, and I have a 1-piece sleeve pattern. The same rules apply here no matter how many pattern pieces join up to create your sleeve. You're going to need to measure the stitching lines. So on my 1-piece sleeve, I have come in my 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres, along the sleeve cap and along both of the seams for the underarm here. Obviously, if you're working with more pattern pieces, you will need to do this for each of the pattern pieces. Work with pencil. I am simply working with Sharpie so that it's clear for you to see. Again, if you don't have seam allowances on your pattern, then you'll be measuring the outside edge of your pattern. Now, with the sleeve, we want to have a measurement for the entire armhole, but it will also be good to have a measurement for the front armhole and the back armhole. So, the front armhole is from the notch at the top of the sleeve. This is what connects to the shoulder or the notch or marking such as a circle or a square on your pattern. And the front of the sleeve is where you have a single notch that will end where the stitching line for the underarm meets the stitching line for the sleeve cap. The back goes from the notch at the top for the shoulder all the way down where you have 2 notches for the back down to where the stitching lines meet. So you want to have a front measurement and a back measurement as well, because it may be that you've only made alterations to the front of the pattern, so the front of the sleeve needs to be altered rather than the back. And when measuring, I will simply work my way along using the edge of my tape measure to take an accurate measurement of the curve. Now, once you have all of your measurements for the sleeve cap and for the armhole, it's time to consider what the differences are. Now, this is going to depend on a number of things, and what I would recommend here is that if you have made alterations to a pattern, that you actually go back and measure the original stitching line of the sleeve and the armhole prior to you having made the alterations, because you want to know what the pattern designer designed for the difference between the sleeve and the armhole. Now, generally speaking, a sleeve will be larger than an armhole, and you will need to ease the sleeve to fit the armhole of a garment. The amount of ease added into a sleeve depends, and some designers will use more than others. Personally, I will not add more than 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre of total ease in my sleeve. So my sleeve measurement will not be larger than the armhole measurement by any more than 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre. And that's for a simple blouse, dress, top. Now for a jacket or coat, I may add more, up to about 1 inch, 2.5 centimetres. So this is where it's good to know what the original pattern measured at the sleeve and armhole, because the difference between those measurements and the difference between them at the front and the back is going to be what you're aiming for. And you will find that some pattern designers include more ease than I have suggested here. So in this pattern, I would be expecting my sleeve to be 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre larger than the total armhole. And it's actually correct. Even though I've made the adjustments, I am happy with that. I also would want to check the difference between the front sleeve and the front armhole and the back sleeve and the back armhole, just to check that all of my ease wasn't on one side of the sleeve, especially if you've made adjustments to just one side of the body, the front or the back. And again, because my total ease in the sleeve, then 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre, I would personally like to divide that in half and have half of the ease on the front, half of the ease on the back. So I would aim to have a 1/4 inch ease in the front of the sleeve, or 5 millimetres, and a 1/4 inch ease in the back of the sleeve, or 5 millimetres. So just to show you an example, my back armhole measured 8.5 inches, and my sleeve measures 8 3/4 inches. So I have 1/4 inch of ease in the back sleeve here, and that's 5 millimetres approximately. It doesn't matter if you're working with centimetres or inches here. Now, my front sleeve measurement was 8 3/8, my front armhole measurement was 8 1/8. So again, I have achieved my aim of a 1/4 inch or 5 millimetres of ease in the front armhole. Now it gets tricky if your sleeve doesn't measure what it should. So perhaps you've gone back to the original pattern, you've measured the sleeve, you've measured the armhole, and you should be aiming for, say for example, 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres of ease. However, you don't have that. Perhaps you have more, or perhaps you have a lot less. Perhaps your sleeve won't actually fit your armhole at the moment. Then you have to start to make some decisions. And the first thing I would recommend that you do here, if you have a great discrepancy between the sleeve and the armhole, is that you make the garment without the sleeve. In a sample, so make a toile, make a muslin in calico, and check that you're happy with the armhole. Because you want to check that the alterations you've made to the pattern, or if you're drafting your own pattern, that you're happy with the shape of the armhole around the body. Is the armhole currently too tight? Is it currently too loose? Is the shoulder point of the armhole in the right place? Is the underarm point of the armhole in the right place? Is it too high? Is it too low? What is the stitching line of the armhole like as it comes down the front of the body and back of the body? Are you happy with that? Because it will allow you to make a decision as to whether you need to alter the armhole or whether you need to alter the sleeve. Now, if the armhole is perfectly correct and you're happy with it and you need to alter the sleeve, then there are a number of things that you can do. The first thing is that you could extend or reduce the stitching lines at the underarm points here. However, you want to do this by a maximum of 1/2 inch or 1 centimetre on each side. Any more than that, and you will be throwing things off. So what if you need to adjust more than that? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because it does depend on the adjustments that you made to your pattern, or if you perhaps have drafted your pattern from scratch and your sleeve doesn't fit, then perhaps your sleeve draft actually isn't correct. Because the amendments that you make to the sleeve cap can affect other things, such as Does your bicep fit into the sleeve? Is it too large on the bicep? Is it too small on the bicep? You're going to want to check that your bicep will fit into the sleeve. You haven't got too much or too little ease. So you want to be taking a measurement from where your stitching line at the sleeve cap joins the underarm stitching line on both sides. That's your bicep measurement. So in terms of other areas you can adjust the sleeve, you can reduce or increase the height of the sleeve cap. You can change the shape of this. This depends on your figure. If you have done some lengthening or shortening to the armhole in the front and or the back, you may find that you need to do the same to the sleeve cap. Lengthen or shorten your pattern in here. So unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer that I can give you here. It depends on the amendments that you made to the pattern that you're working on, and your individual body. I will do some tutorials though in the coming weeks on how to increase or decrease the bicep of the sleeve for a major adjustment. So not simply adding or removing here, but adding into the center of the sleeve. This is something you can do if your bicep doesn't fit into the sleeve, or perhaps you need to alter the sleeve cap to fit into the armhole and then it makes your bicep too small. So I'll be sharing that with you in the coming weeks. But as always, if you have any questions regarding this and what you should be doing with your pattern, then please do contact me. You can post messages below and I will aim to get back to you, or you can find me on Facebook or Instagram with Made to Sew. Another part of truing the sleeve is making sure that the curve from the single notch around the underarm and from the double notch around the underarm is the same on the sleeve as it is on the garment, so that they sew together nicely, or that they're as similar as they can be. So to do this, what you're going to need to do is to trace this shape from the garment onto the sleeve. And it's from the underarm to the first notch. So again, you might be working with more sleeve pieces, you may have a slightly different pattern to me, but the key is from that underarm, whether it's a seam or whether it's a notch, up to the single notch for the front, and then the same for the back. So a couple of different ways you can do this. The first one is to turn my sleeve over and position that on top of the pattern. I simply want to match the underarm seam and that first notch. Now, depending on the paper that you're working with, you may find it easier to see through, you may not. So you may be able to look through and actually trace the shape from my garment pattern piece onto the sleeve. Or you may find that actually you're better off doing it the other way up. So having the garment on the top and actually using your tracing wheel to wheel that onto the sleeve pattern. And actually mine, because I didn't make any amendments here, is spot on. That all matches up nicely. I can just about see through this paper. It depends on the paper you're working with. Standard pattern cutting paper, dot and cross paper is slightly see-through, so you should be able to see through that. But if you prefer, work with tracing paper or use a tracing wheel if you're working with thicker paper. This is paper that's been printed in a print shop. I would do this for the front, and I would do exactly the same for the shape on the back there. Checking that it was, if it's not 100% perfect, that it's near enough spot on when you're going to be sewing them together. You also want to check that the notches on the sleeve are in the same place as they are on the garment, because they're simply connecting points. The front notch will go to the front notch on the garment, the double notch will go to the double notch on the garment at the back. Now, when I position my notches onto my pattern, I normally position them 3 inches up from the underarm, whether it's a seam, a notch, a circle, a square, whatever the marking is on your pattern. And if I'm working in centimetres, I generally do 7 centimetres. Now, on the back of the sleeve, I will position my notches, one at 3 inches and one at 3 1/4 inches. 7 and then 7.5 centimetres. And the key is that the notches need to be in the same measurement on the garment pattern pieces so that you can connect them. The notch at the top should match to either a notch, a circle, a square, or a shoulder seam, depending on the pattern that you're working with. So there you have it. These are the measurements that you need to do when truing a sleeve together. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and the series of tutorials all about truing darts, seams and sleeves. Thank you for watching and see you again soon.